This video is part of a series to help us understand environmental law and environmental and social justice. I am Lenny Librizzi of the Environment TV. I recently had a conversation with Joel Kupferman of the New York Environmental Law and Justice Project. Joel and I have known each other many years. We originally met when we were both involved in the anti-Shoreham Nuclear Power Plant protests in the 1970s and 1980s. Here is a conversation we had about the multifaceted campaign to stop Shoreham from operating. Is there a environmental law case that you might say was like the first big victory or one big victory that led the way to other things happening?
Yeah, I think it was a case that you and I were both involved in. It goes back to a little trajectory off of Manhattan Island called Long Island. It was out in Suffolk County, the Shoreham Nuclear Plant, and they decided at first to place it, and this is almost a classic example of environmental justice and injustice. They wanted to place it in Lloyd Neck, in a it's probably one of the wealthiest areas of Long Island, and then people screamed and then decided to move a little further out, even though it was bucolic, to, I guess, people that were less organized and less titans of capitalism, you could say. And they picked a place called Shoreham, and they said, and it happened to be Brookhaven National Lab, if you remember, so it was all these nuke scientists, and for a while, nuke energy was the panacea that was going to...
Too cheap to meter.
Cheap to meter, right, too cheap to meter, exactly.
Right. What Joel is referring to is the Shoreham Nuclear Power Plant, which was a project of the Long Island Lighting Company at the time, and they've morphed into other things since then. And they initially had a plan to build, I think, a dozen nuclear power plants at different places on Long Island. But you know, in case of environmental justice here, that the haves were able to get it moved from their backyard into someone else's backyard. But the backyard in this case ended up being an island where it would have been impossible to evacuate if there was an accident.
And so, right, the main road that opened up Long Island was the Long Island Expressway, and sometimes people call it the Long Island parking lot, or the longest parking lot in the world, whatever. So it was, in some ways, my first real taste of the facts being twisted in terms of saying no impact and saying that even if 1 million people decided to get onto that highway at once, there'd be no impact on the flow of traffic. So we began to recognize, and maybe you didn't take it right away, that I'd be facing these people who get paid top dollars to spin the story, and I guess there's a big rubber stamp out there, unfortunately, called no impact. And even though we go through the motions of environmental reviews and studies, it's that stamp that comes out and gets stamped.
So this all happened before there was Esquire after your name, is that correct?
Yes.
So would you say this might have been the thing that convinced you to go into law, and environmental law in particular, instead of corporate law or contract law?
I would say it had a social justice bent, and it's like the environmental crept in, and then it's beginning to see that the environmental and social justice could be a similar field. But you have a very good point that we worked with some really good lawyers. I think one was Irving Like, there was others, and there were similar cases after that everywhere I went to do something in terms of advocacy, they said you should get a lawyer. And then after writing lawyers' names down and numbers and losing it and finding it again, I figured it might be easier just if I became a lawyer, memorize my own number and go from there.
Okay.
It's a question of resources is really important. And then over time, it's not just a minor point, I'm just minimizing the effect, is that it really determines outcome, okay? Because when you go through the courts, and then we're beginning to question ourselves now that if we don't have the resources to push it all the way through, we know we're losing. We're just adding a little gloss to the system. We're sort of making the bad system work, or they're claiming that it's working because there's some objection, sort of know what we're losing. But there has been some notable wins that are out there, and we're finding that the way to do it is to involve the community, and also being, I would say, as an environmental justice lawyer, and we'll talk a little more about why I'm also affiliated with the National Lawyers Guild. We also believe that the courts and the litigation is one part of the struggle. That most of the time it's to create a speed bump, to stop something from going in, and to give the community a lot of times time to gather around. But most of the cases, things have changed when there's enough public outcry, and there's been a struggle for a while, and the political start, opening up and listening. So we do a lot of cases knowing we're not going to win, but we're in it for the long haul. A lot of times that's the important part.
It's raising awareness. So let's finish the Shoreham story now. Okay. So Lilco starts building a nuclear power plant, and there's a lot of controversy about it, but they just, they were on a mission, and they built it to completion, and even fired it up low power to test it.
Which I got to say was really insulting, because people knew, and some people said that they knew they weren't going to do it, and it's also like, it was all our complaints that that radioactivity is going to last for a long time. They basically put it into, they burnt us. They gave, it's like getting kicked in the head on the way out the door.
Right. So it got to that point of being low power tested, but it has that plant is mothballed at the moment and has never produced a watt of energy commercially for sale.
Correct.
So what happened?
We basically went into court and, through our lawyers, pushed hard enough to basically say that this place would never not be safe, and evacuation really wouldn't take place. So we got in front of the right judge to get the right decision.
And it really hinged on the ability to evacuate if there was ever an accident.
Right.
And local kept pushing on, creating whatever their faulty evacuation plan was. Mm-hmm. And then it took actually an act from the governor at the time, Mario Cuomo, to say, no, I can't sign off on this, and that was basically the death knell for Shoreham.
Right.
So it was
the courts was putting it in a holding pattern, and then we got the governor to come in.
Right. It wasn't just the lawsuit, and it wasn't just Mario Cuomo, it wasn't just the evacuation plan, but it was an effort on from many directions. Well, there were ratepayers strikes. There were nonviolent demonstrations. There were rallies. There were letter writing campaigns. I mean, it in terms of being a model for how do you successfully do an environmental justice plan or fight an environmental justice case. The reason you're saying this is a good example is just a single thing that made it happen.
It happened in the 70s.
Right.
Into the 80s.
Well, initially started in the 70s.
Into the 80s. And I think America, and I even say the rest of the world, was beginning to wake up. And in some ways that was a wake-up call. And I got to say that even though many times I've been critical of the suburbs, Long Island at that time was a good place to be, that the consciousness grew. And I think when you mentioned it, right, it was all these different groups coming together. And we also became media savvy, that we also learned that at the time the big paper was Newsday. And I remember I gave them some credit for trying to undo us. And I think our biggest rally was when it was 95 degrees. We gathered something like 80,000 people on the beach, which is pretty big for a Long Island rally. And the articles that they wrote said the organizers were upset because they expected 100,000. So I realized no matter what we did, they'd always do that. But I think over time we got Newsday on us, on our side.
This has been just scratching the surface about environmental law and environmental justice, and learning about some of the things that Joel has done, and what our successes have been, and what the pitfalls have been, and what the little bumps in the road are, but hopefully the trajectory is leading towards the work that you're doing, and that the environmentalists and the social justice and the environmental justice advocates have been fighting for is starting to bear some fruit. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I saw a great big tourist bus of folks from out of town. For 40 days and 40 nights, they covered miles of ground. They had a map and compass, but they still were not arriving. Oh, they couldn't get to Pleasantville, so they kept on driving. And then one day the sirens blew, the county was aghast. It seemed the aging nuke plant had an accident at last. The stockholders who fainted couldn't be reached for reviving. And they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. The highways turned to parking lots from Albany to Queens. The politicians learned just what evacuation means. They frantically assembled all their staff for some contriving. But they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. They knew the Hudson River was contaminated now. The radiation off the charts of what they could allow. They cursed the leaky nuke plants and its owners for their jiving. But they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving.